here to welcome Professor or visiting Professor and researcher Susan Herrington from the School of Architecture and Landscapes Architecture at the University of British Columbia, Canada. As the coordinator of the Research Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies, I am very pleased that you accept our invitation to be our visiting researcher, and especially concerning your topics of interest and the lecture of today, as it dialogues perfectly with the area of research that we are also exploring in our research center, connected with the landscape and aesthetics, in particularly the New European Bauhaus movement that is today's European Council projects. It's supported, financed by this institution, and we have a project in this area. So at the same time, the Coimbra Bauhaus was officially recognized a new European Bauhaus local chapter for the Coimbra region. And this is one of the first initiatives we have in the Coimbra Bauhaus. So it's an honor for us that you accept to present and to have your lecture in this framework concerning the Coimbra Bauhaus. I would say no more. I will give the floor to more focused presentation about the lecture of today. And once again, thank you so much, Susan, for your kindness and for your generosity to present your research today here for us in person and for those that are online watching this lecture. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to my colleague, Professor Carmen Swart, coordinator of the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies. I'll only speak briefly for 1 minute because the floor is, of course, to Professor Susan Herrington, who kindly accepted the invitation to do this conference for us. And so, concerning the introduction, as Professor Carmen Swart said, Professor Susan Herrington is a professor at the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, University of British Columbia, where she teaches histories of landscape architecture, theories in landscape architecture, and design studios in the Master of Landscape Architecture program. And to put it very briefly, her research explores the spatial and material practices of contemporary landscape architects, analyzing how landscapes influence the construction of nature, identity, and space. I hope I got this right. She will be giving a talk titled Gardens of Inclusivity in Interwar with Cristopher Tunnard landscape building. We know that Susan is writing a book on Cristopher Tunnard, and given all that was already said, basically the institution of the Coimbra Bauhaus local chapter, basically, and the fact that we are just starting to have the first activities now, it is really a great honor. And also get the interdisciplinary nature of our center that brings, that mixes, classics with philosophy, with theater, music, etc. And so also playing aesthetics or venturing forth and exploring aesthetics in several different ways. Bringing the work of Cristopher Tunnard that we don't know that well, and basically emphasizing the ways in which the ideas of beauty, inclusivity, etc. will appear in his work, both in his theory and in his practice, I guess, in the way it kind of perhaps anticipated or perhaps inspires, queer theory, etc. Strikes us as a very, very interesting and innovative topic, I would say, that we are eager to listen. And so, Susan, thank you once again. And feel free to do your presentation. We'll do a small discussion at the end. I'll just leave you the floor and not get into the way of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming. And it's such a small group. So just if you have a question or while I'm talking, something that doesn't make sense, you repeat something, just let me know. happy to share it with you. But yes, as Gonzalez was saying, I am writing a book on Christopher Tunnard. And you probably never heard of him, even if you're an architecture student or a landscape architecture student. My work on him is really in debt to Cornelia Oberlander, who is a Canadian landscape architect, who I wrote a book on, Cornelia Oberlander. She's very interesting. She's probably Canada's most important landscape architect. And in writing a book, I found out a lot about her. And in the 1940s, she was one of the first cohorts of women to enter the graduate school of design at Harvard University. And she said she wanted to go there. She wanted to work with Walter Gropius, who was there teaching in architecture, and she wanted to go with Christopher Tunnard. And I was like, "Who's that?" She goes, "You've got to know about Christopher Tunnard. He inspired modern landscape architecture in America and in much of England." And when she got to Harvard, she wasn't able to interact with him. He was there on a real right. He had been teaching, but the faculty wouldn't let him interact with the students. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because he was gay." And so I thought, well, that's absurd. And I was shocked. I was like, "That's someone who should write that." And, when I was writing a book with her, and so I was doing research at Harvard, I came upon this faculty meeting in the landscape architecture department, where they are trying to get rid of this faculty member. And reading it away, and they're like, "Well, why don't we tell him to join the Canadian Army?" And he was the only Canadian teaching at faculty at that point. He wasn't in this particular meeting for landscape architects. And just when I was turning the page, his archivist walks up and removes the folder from my hands and said that I had to get the president of the university's permission to look at this. And I was never able to look at it. And they've now informed me that in 2036, I was. So anyway, that made me very interested. The more I thought about it, someone should really write about it, because the more I learned about him and how he influenced modern landscape architecture, the more I got interested in, how he was able to perceive it so young and so early. And then one of my last conversations with Oberlander before she died was she was really angry because of some books had come out about him. And she said they just didn't understand him, and she didn't think that they treated him very well and didn't put him in the right light. They didn't understand how influential he was. And so I told her I was going to write the book on him. So I did, and I have. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today. I mentioned queer scholar John Tobin notes that historical scholarship is fundamentally an act of giving or renewing a voice that has been silenced. So that's what I really feel like I'm doing in doing this research. So the lecture, I'm going to just give you a really quick brief introduction of who he is, Christopher Tunnard, and I'll talk a little about queer theories that you may or may not be informed of. I think there's a lot more queer theory in architecture than there is in landscape architecture. And I'm going to talk about queering the modern landscape in his amazing project, St. Anne's Hill in Surrey, and his book, Gardens in the Modern Landscape, that shaped so much of modern thinking in landscape architecture. So he grew up in Canada, in Western Canada, and British Columbia. And he spent his first 18 years there. And then from 1928 to 1939, he's in England. And this is really when he does most of his amazing landscape architecture work. He then completely goes in the closet, gets married, and becomes a planner at Yale. It kind of leaves his whole life behind. So I'm really focusing on this time period when he's a young man. His parents were immigrants. They're called Tunnard immigrants. They were both landed gentry from England, and his mother's parents went to Australia, and his father went to Canada, and then they met in Canada. This is a photo. This I'm pretty sure is his mother, and then his father standing here. This is the grouping of the family. They talked about how tall they were. These people were pretty tall, especially her. I'm pretty sure that's who it is. This is his house that Dominic and I visited in the town of Beaufort, which is just outside of Victoria. And it's kind of interesting because it's very close to this whole network urban rail system. I often wonder if someone grows up in a neighborhood and they start to see these kind of patterns of development, if that kind of sparks their interests later in life. They lived in a pretty modest arts and craft house, which he would seriously critique as a young man. This has been renovated about 10 years ago. And he spent 1 year in Victoria College in 1928. Here he is. Of course, they separated the women from the men. And he excels in both history and in English. And then when he turns 18, this is just, we found this in the archives, just a kind of a cue to his personality. He appears a lot doing recitals in the sort of magazines and newspapers around the time in Victoria. But this was actually a business card that I found that has him doing movies in vaudeville at age 18, and then he lists the Royal Theatre as his house. So I think he was very interested in theater. His brother was an actor. And when he turns 18, his mother takes him to London. And I think they see a lot of theater. He probably sees a lot of gardens. If you've ever been to England, they're just crazy for gardens. They're everywhere. But they probably saw a lot of theater. It was actually kind of an interesting summer to be in London because Radcliffe Hall had published what's considered the first lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness. And it was in the courts, and they were banning it, and there was all this debate in the newspaper about whether it should have been published in the first place. We also have Noel Coward, who would really epitomize the kind of queer aesthetic of the 1920s and 30s, putting on plays, and I think he just saw this whole world that didn't exist in this little town in Canada anymore. And so he refuses to come home. He's staying in London. And I know this because on the manifest, it shows his mother's name and then his name. And then his name is crossed out and it says refuse to board. So he really didn't want to go to Canada. So he stays there and he enrolls in the Royal Horticultural Society and gets a diploma in horticulture for 2 years. And he learned lots of technical information about gardening, but not so much design. I mean, that's going to be just self-cultivated. But he does his first job for a man named Percy King, who was a garden designer and author, pretty conservative, did a lot of private residences. You'd call this kind of academic eclectic work. So it was either done formal or informal. He was known for these sort of Italianate gardens. So very conservative. And he works there for about 2 years. And the big thing about it is that Percy King's office was in London. So he moves to London. He's living in Paddington. And again, there's a whole culture there. He has his cousin, John Tunnard, who was a sort of surrealist painter, who's there, and then his other cousin, Viola, who is a pianist. And there's also a time that's written about that there was this interwar period, there was just a lot more freedom of expression of sexuality that had been private. There was obviously lots of mixing, and this is Matt Holbrook's book, and he writes about queer London, that there was constant censorship, but then there was also some acceptance and kind of a finding of a home in London. And London starts to become this sort of queer capital. And Tunnard's living right like a block away from Hyde Park, which is a major cruising area. And it's also during a time when England is experimenting with modern architecture.
because there was all this modern architecture happening on the continent, and they were a little slower to adapt. Being English, they were still very interested in history, and they were trying to kind of define their own English modernism. And of course, as David Dean points out, the modernists slip readily, though not always consciously, from the idea of building homes and workplace to the idea of redesigning society itself. So a lot of them had, very novel living arrangements. They lived together communally. Here's Isokon Place in London that was designed by Wells Coates, who was also a Canadian. And has anyone been to Isokon in London? So this was kind of a plan, 1934 is when it was built. It was built by the Pritchards, and she was a child psychologist, and he was in the plywood industry. And they were very, very small apartments. And the idea was that you would live and eat together. So you did a lot of things. And of course, they had the biggest flat on the top of penthouse. So they had tons of social events up there as well. But it was just trying to find new patterns of living that was replacing the sort of old parts of living. A lot of artists lived there. Walter Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus, of course, lives there for 3 years, as does Marcel Breuer. Agatha Christie lives there. So a lot of interesting people staying in Isokon. And actually, Tunnard ends up designing a garden Isokon later on. But one of the last projects that Tunnard works on for Percy King is for the Schlesingers in London. And they have a huge garden space, and he does, on Addison Road in London and Herrington, and he does one of his very kind of formal Italian designs for it. And Tunnard's working on the project. And Tunnard obviously meets A.L. Schlesinger, the owner, and his wife, but must have been love at first sight, because by 1934, Schlesinger, who was a very wealthy stockbroker, there's a sketch. We don't have any photographs of him, but here's a sketch of him by Gordon Cullen. But in 1934, they're living together in a small town called Popham. And his wife, Peggy, is herself. And so they move in together, and they're planning to move up to Chertsey, where they discovered a piece of property, which is just right up here. And this part of Surrey, it's got a lot of historic gardens and landscape gardens in it. And they're going to build one of the houses that I'm going to talk about, which is St. Anne's Court in Chertsey, which is a phenomenal building. We've been to it. But I'm going to just pause here and talk a little bit about queer theories, because when I got into this project, I discovered I had to really educate myself. If I was going to start to interpret his work and his writing. So Halpern said that queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. And if we trace the historiography of sex, we can find that going straight back to Foucault, who was one of the first to kind of make the point that sexuality was not natural, scientifically defined treatment, but a social construction. And he talks about how it kind of evolves almost as a distinct species. And, prior really to the Victorians, things were much more looser. Things were, you could have a friend that you had a sexual relationship and you were the same sex, and it wasn't sort of solidified as you were homosexual, you were heterosexual. And this leads to a whole bunch of studies, including Butler's very influential Gender Troubles, that forms the basis of queer theory, trans studies, disability studies, and cultural studies, interrogate sexuality, the body. And Butler has this theory of performativity, and she contends that categories of gender, sex, and sexuality were constructed through performance. which is not self-determined, but controlled and represented through hegemonic structures. And probably one of the most notorious hegemonic structures are these binary categories of man and women that you just kind of assume is natural and deemed, heterosexual desire as natural. And so this erases and pathologizes those not identifying as man and woman and those not with heterosexual desire. And this leads in the 1990s to lots of queer theories and architectural theories looking at sexuality, from Beatrice Kolominen to Darren Betsky. And this work influences 2 decades of theoretical interpretations of architectural space, thought to destabilize the literal and metaphorical binaries of the wall, unpack the queer narrative of the closet, and reaffirm the nexus of same-sex desires and the body's in conception of space from house to the. There's also a whole bunch of urban theories that develop around queerness as well. So Christopher Reeve's Eminent Domain really looks at queer theory as a political project in which public spaces and neighborhoods and commercial venues become queer territory. There's even some historical work on preservation movement, how it was really, directed a response to the public concern of declining nature of city. We combined this rise of public discourse of urban demasculation. At the same time, there's this anti-urban and movement phase. So while LGBTQ2+ people were criticized as being against nature, they historically used ideas of nature, natural space, ecological practices as sites of resistance and of exploration. And so it's it's not a surprise that the 2 protagonists in Brokenback Mountain are shepherds, and they are occupying movable spaces. And then, of course, we see the development of queer theory, which tries to disrupt prevailing heterosexist discourse and institutionalized articulations of sexuality and nature. And really kind of, sort of the queering of nature and biology to resist sexual heterosexual repression that's rooted in sort of ecological benchmarks, even the nomenclature and other practices of ecological and biological sciences. So there's been a lot of study of animals. This is Electra and Viola in New York City, who are a lesbian penguin couple that has a huge Facebook following. But people tend to think of animals as being male and female, being heterosexual. It's not. It doesn't map out into reality. In fact, some of the earliest discussions of this take place in 1913 in the London Zoo with penguins. And there's tons of animals. There's some animals that change sex. Also, if we look at the plant nomenclature, the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus developed a binomial nomenclature of plants and taxonomy used by all my landscape architecture students, still used. And, if you read his writing, he uses words like marriage, husband and wife, talk of plants. And you're introducing, he described petals as bridal beds. And so it just links with all this heterosexual descriptions of plant reproduction. And as Subramanian and Bartlett point out, the idea of these individual plants having distinct genders doesn't work. 85% of flowering plants have both male and female parts. It doesn't even make sense in terms of the plant itself, and they warn this sort of normalization, naturalization of Western colonial ideology as biology. And then one of the last sort of queer theories I'll talk about is queer domesticities. This is a more recent development in around 2016. This uses queer methodology as a lens. It relates to the homes and homemaking practices of lesbians, gay men, bisexual, trans people, and other sexual and gender minorities. And this is a picture of actually Cedric Morris and Arthur Let Haynes, which I always thought looked like Christopher Tunnard and A.L. Schlesinger. But queer domesticity discourse challenges presumption of heterosexuality, an ideal coupling, and the site of normative practices underpinning socially sanctioned concepts of family and home. And so, and I think this was, when I was writing a lot about the housing projects of the 1950s and Cornelia, was always the mother and the father and the three kids. There was this concept of home. So this is really pushing up against this idea. And again, I was not able to find any clear histories of domestic architecture. It just didn't seem to be there. So I've had to really look at these other theories that relate to it really nicely. So going back to Schlesinger and Tunnard, take his Rolls Royce up to Selcott. And this is when I should point out that Christopher Tunnard was born Arthur Tunnard. And it was right up around this time when he moves with Schlesinger that he calls himself Cristopher. I don't know if it's because A.L. Schlesinger's first name was also Arthur, or one of his father's name was Christopher, but he starts calling himself Cristopher, and everyone starts calling him Christopher. So it's kind of a remaking of himself when he does that. So they find this site on St. Anne's Hill in Chertsey, very prominent hill since the 19th century, actually. And it's very distinct not only for its geomorphology, but just its pure height. So in 1778, the site was used on a survey from Windsor Castle as part of the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. And this becomes, one of the surveying sites when they're planning out the Great Ordnance Survey of Great Britain. It's also because of its height, it becomes very popular among topographical poets who write the valley. So it's also owned by two very well-known controversial pair, and that is Elizabeth Armistead and Charles James Fox. And Armistead is a very high-end prostitute, and she has acquired quite a bit of money. And she, in about late 18th century, she purchased St. Anne's Hill and built a huge house there. She falls in love with Charles James Fox, who was a Whig statesman, and he was known for his oratory and charismatic presentations, House of Commons, and it's a huge controversy because they're living together. Let's say they actually get married in secret in 1795 in Paris, but it's a huge controversy. And this is the house that they built in 1822. And it just grows as it owns. I mean, she eventually dies. They lived there, and they actually did a lot to the landscape. They built a lot of structures, a lot of pieces of land. But by the early 1900s, the building has been added to on. They put these silly little plantings in the lawn, which Tunnard rips out. And they don't want this big rambling house. They want to build their own house. And so they go to Raymond McGraw. And Raymond McGraw was from Australia. And he was really one of the architects who was looking at this idea of a modern house becoming a testing ground for new conceptions of home and relationships among people. really the idea that the modern design could reaffirm not heterosexual relationships. And probably one of the most important projects he works on prior to working on St. Anne's Hill is the house for Mansfield Forbes. And Forbes was a Don in Cambridge, and he lived and bought a house that he completely renovates as vanilla. And it's a very interesting renovation because he uses a lot of sort of reflective material, and that's because the Scottish he bases it on the Scottish mythological vanilla. So it's one of the first houses that kind of uses this metaphor of the Scottish queen for its design. And it's also the alter ego for Forbes, who was this very flamboyant gay Don. And this whole house becomes kind of this nexus point for meetings of modern architects. So Gropius will come here, Raymond McGraw, and kind of all the proto-modernists in England. And here's sort of the construction of St. Anne's Court, which is based on this giant circle. Kind of get a scale of it. They completely ripped down this house, and people were amazed that they were able to do this because it was a historic house. It had been owned by a pretty famous person. But it turned out that Schlesinger was actually kind of, I think, supporting a lot of the design review council people in Chertsey. And so I think he was able to get away with it. So here it is going up. It was one of the first concrete board structures. Here's the entrance. That's very striking, and you can't see in these photographs, they're black and white, but it's pink. And here it is. And then they kept this original kind of what they call the Staley block, where they lived while they were constructing this. It has this architectural garden that jets out in the center point of the circle with a pool. And it's interesting because this kind of comes out and touches one of the remaining walls of the house, which is kind of unusual. And then this is that garden that projects out into the east part. Here it is sort of painted. Here it is with all those amoebic planting beds removed. And then this huge circular, curving pool that goes around this very old rhododendron plant. These are some of the structures that Elizabeth Armistead and Fox build when they're there, that he spends time preserving, renovating. This is actually got a tea house, and then this grotto space with these shelves and pig knuckles lighting it. So here's the house. Here's that architectural garden. Here's the lamp. This is the Temple of Friendship. And there's a stable block in an aerial. And so when they move in, of course, they have tons of parties. They have lots of guests. They come and visit. And they show off the house and the landscape. A lot of people from the press come. C.H. Riley was a professor of architecture and editor of the Architect's Journal. And they often say the similar thing. This is a design for living in a modern way. And when you're thinking, well, this is for a gay couple, but that's kind of interesting that they were seeing that this is part of modernity, that we have this more expanded concept of what makes a couple and what makes a home. I could see great possibilities of drama, real or imaginary. Lance Sidking, who was a producer with the BBC, he described St. Anne's Court, that this is truly living in a modern way. And I have a student put these in Rhino, the architectural drawings, and then render them. Because I've never seen it before. You hear the descriptions talking about pink, but since all the photographs in black and white, you don't get a sense what that is. But I really see queer domesticity playing out 3 ways that are kind of hiding in plain sight. The juxtaposition of differences in relational space, and this homage to Charles Fox and Elizabeth Armistead. So hiding in plain sight is exactly what it means. So it's the fact that it was for this queer couple, but it was in all the magazines, it's in Tunnard's books, everyone was talking about it, everyone was talking about going to their luncheons. So it's out there, but it's an open secret. And there's also this obfuscation that happens. I mean, when you see it from the street, it obviously doesn't look like the other houses on the block. But it's pretty covered. This goes to the entranceway, and these are all servants. They have lots of servants. It's 6 servants for the 2 of them. And then the back opens up, and you can see that this is the architectural guard. Had some deterioration in 1969. And then more of this obfuscation happens when you walk into the front entryway. And it's just all mirror. It's just sort of dizzying to see, and this is a vitroflex that's got a plan view of Tunnard's landscape on it. It's been etched into it. And Brent Pikely says that the entranceways were private. Subjectivity and home are interwoven into productions itself. And even when we were there visiting, you can't quite see the drawing because of the vitroflex. Can't even really take a photograph. And the sitting room is that main circular area that we saw being constructed. It's very interesting because you can see, and McGraw designs everything in this house. He designs not only the building, but all the furnishings, all the furniture. And he does the draperies, which go all the way and go across the doorway, across the window, and go all the way around to meet this. You could close off the entire, like this literal and physical veil. It'll look like this giant dressing room. For privacy. Up above, their main sitting room is their bedroom. And this is very interesting because I found out from like a 1977 interview with McGraw, where he was describing, how do you design a bedroom for a queer couple when it's illegal? And so what he did was he created this circular space and then these alcoves that jet out. And the idea is that during the day, you could move these out into the alcoves and then again take that curtain and wrap it around so that it looked. So you would notice it. So it's a very interesting technique, I think you could call. The second thing is this idea of this juxtaposition of difference and relational space that you'll see in St. Anne's Hill. You see a lot of this in queer domesticity, this desire to bring things together from different time periods. And this is a classic photo of St. Anne's Court and St. Anne's Hill with the Temple of Friendship sharing the landscape with the 1930s structure. And something really interesting too is he wraps the pool around the rhododendron, which is just the opposite of what his former boss, Percy Kane, would advise. He always said you wanted to drape hard forms with soft plant material, soften. And here he does the exact opposite. And then here is this garden here with the jetting out. And you'll notice this is that old historic wall, which again, he brings right up to the 1930s wall that this looks out onto the landscape. And it's interesting when you go visit there each day, you think it's just a continuum of the 1930s wall. But when you walk through the other side, you'll see he's exposed the Georgian brick from when it was Elizabeth and Charles Fox's house. In a way, I think this was a homage, his work at St. Anne's Hill, he and McGraw, just like Fenella had been to Forbes' day because their relationship had been so controversial, and so was Schlesinger's and Tunnard's, that he really restores the landscape back to the changes that they made in kind of erases, particularly things that have been done in the Victorian period. So again, one of the structures, this was built in 1794. And it was for Fox's nephew, Bob St. John, and Milkins carved 3 statues of each of the men that sit inside, had originally sat inside of this. And he restored that. Here's in 59. He also restores this tea house. Got the grotto at the base. And this is interesting because they originally had a huge wisteria that climbed the house and went into this big balcony in their bedroom. And so Tunnard saves the wisteria, he doesn't rip it out, and he has it coming up into the balcony of their bedroom. You can see it here. And if you remember from the first photo I sent of this, it's huge now. A lot of these plants are maintained by Kew Gardens because they're so old. And then this is a classic end-to-end shot. You see this in advertisements for Vitroflex. You see it in the architectural magazines of the 1930s, McGraw's architecture. And the bust is a bust, actually a fox. The Nolkins bust that was in that 1794. So the people are all over this. So during this time period, Tunnard meets all these modern architects and starts doing a lot of projects. I noticed that the poster for the lecture had Bentley Wood that he designed for Serge Shremieff on it. And this was a project that he worked on. He also joins the Mars Group, which is the Modern Architecture Research Group, that has a big exhibit in 1938. He's on television. I think he's one of probably the first modern landscape architects to be on television.
So can you mind if we turn the lights on?
Oh, no.
Do you think it would work? It's getting kind of gloomy. Assuming they will work. Yes. Sorry, seems a bit. Sorry, please,
He's been writing articles about stuff he was designing, projects he was working on for the architectural review. And so in 1938, the editors asked him to compile those together into a book called Garden Landscape. So and this is what makes him quite famous, is this book. And Lawrence Halpern, who was a modern landscape architect in the United States, he talked about it affecting him like a bolt of lightning. Cornelia Oberlander, who I had mentioned in the beginning, she was greatly influenced by his book. He becomes extremely popular because of it. And so I wonder, well, modernism in general goes a lot to queers. Is it a queer manifesto? And I really think it is. I think the queer masculinity that he is carving out for himself, he writes this when he's 28 years old. It's based on William Shenstone, who I'll talk about. I think he advances this landscape aesthetics based on formalism, which we owe much to queer individuals for. A lot of his thoughts on nature prefigure queer ecology. And this idea of his life in a community without boundaries really kind of clashes with the current discourse in planning communal housing. But approaching like the Holbrook Jones and mentioning Paul process rather than a category is this idea of masculinity that men engage in themselves. And he really formulates his queer masculinity through his identification with William Shenstone, which he mentions many, many times in Gardens of the Landscape, Modern Landscape. And, you know, when he's a young man, he's looking for role models, and Percy Payne was not it. He was not impressed with Percy Payne, who was shy, kept his opinions to himself, and working with females in particular. He just didn't identify with that. He also found a 19th century professor was intrigued to be a man of delicacy. He didn't like that as well. So he actually presents images, this miniature gallery of landscape gardeners from the 18th century. And he's got Shenstone. If you think of this as like a flock of birds, Shenstone's at the head, leading them. And Shenstone's I guess when I was reading Gardens of the Modern Landscape, I was like, why is he so obsessed with sensory? Like, you know, he's talking about modernism, modern gardens, and yet, you know, a good chunk of the book is about the 18th century. And according to Haggerty, it was, you know, this time that when same-sex desire hadn't been isolated as the unnatural. So, you know, this is the time period when, you know, you could be more fluid, and not that there weren't, it wasn't illegal, but it just wasn't as regimented and bifurcated to, you know, you were heterosexual or not. So Shenstone wrote poetry, he wrote prose, and he created a garden called Misos, and he did this all at the same time. I mean, there's letters of him writing to his friends about how he has written 2 poems and built a stream. He often posts his poems as he writes them, sometimes tacked on in paper, tacked to a tree, sometimes in stone. And so it's all integrated for him. And a lot has been written about him since Tunnard on queer people looking at queer literature. And so this whole idea of selfhood gets embodied into his garden design, which is a garden that he inherits from his family. And Bull argues that the visitors that came would kind of interpret him through his landscape, that they'd see this caring, considerate feeling man, not made effeminate through his sentimental look, but empowered by it. And there's a lot on how he looked too as well. He refused to wear a wig, he wore his hair sort of long, it was very nice hair. I'm going to go into that anyway. He wasn't married, and you know, he just didn't do things that the other English gentlemen of his class did. He did not master a wife and reproduce offspring, and he did not plant his landscape for his sons, because that's what the English did. In this class, they built and planted for their sons. And you just rejected this whole idea of this connection to reproduction in the garden. In fact, you get incensed if someone asked him if his streams were fish bearing. He also worked very collaboratively. He was very inclusive. So in his sort of coterie of poets, were women, which was abnormal at the time, as well as, you know, shoemakers and people who were not trained as poets at all, but he lit them into his circle. And so I think Tunnard was very inspired by this inclusivity as well. He also, I think, borrows some of Shenstone's publication ideas and what Sedgwick has called the open secret. So this is the frontispiece of the works. And it's got Shenstone being crowned by Apollo. This is a book that Tunnard cites quite a bit in his book and quotes from. And there's a lot been written about this image because it's a bit strange. It's a bit weird. And I found it's actually a replication of Pasqualini being crowned by Apollo by CECH-UC in 1641. And this is commissioned by Pasqualini's lover, Cardinal Barberini, and it's crowning his lover, who was a Straussian. And so you can see the sort of open secret that Shenstone is telling you in his book in the frontispiece, which then I think Tunnard gets inspired by, because this is the cover to Gardens in the Modern Landscape. This is a drawing by Gordon Cullen, Weekend House. In the background is Telemachus on the island of Collapsus. Telemachus is being sought after by Calypsos, and here's Venus giving the Cupid to her. And so it's a bit of a love story, although more of a tragic love story. And this is actually wallpaper that he rips out from the house he rips down to build St. Anne's Court. I know that because a bill of sale talks about this wallpaper from the 1930s when they buy the house. And then when we look at the sketch itself, this is the Weekend House in Cobham. It never gets built. And then this is Tunnard, and that's Schlesinger. And they are in very risque swimsuits, because it's only in 1937 that men were allowed to wear swimsuits that risque. They were supposed to come up with this bib that covered your chest. So it was quite unique. And then appears again in the book a section on Goussier on style. So the styles are alive. Style is the unity of principle animating the work of an epoch, the result of its taste and mind, which has its own special character. Our epoch is determining day by day its own style. Our eyes, unhappily, are unable to discern it. So it's, a kind of interesting place to put this drawing that your eyes do not discern. He also, in Gardens of the Modern Landscape, bases a lot of his appreciation using formalism. And a lot of this comes from Walter Pater, who challenged the moral role of art in Victorian society. And according to Whitney Davis, the discursive opposition between erotic and the aesthetic that's existed in Western philosophy since Kant. And one of the first architectural historians to study Pater is Henry Russell Hitchcock, who is a very good close friend of Tunnard's, who Tunnard spends many evenings talking with him about art. And they'll be friends their entire life. You probably, if you know Hitchcock at all, he was considered one of the first people to write about formalism in architecture. He and Philip Johnson had an exhibit in 1932 in MoMA, International Style. So here's one of his descriptions of appreciation of concrete. The surface of this painting was treated with carbonum at the floating stage, partly to prevent slipperiness in wet weather, and partly the sparkle which this material imparts in sunlight. So that's throughout his sort of material descriptions in Gardens in the Modern Landscapes, that we should appreciate materials for what they are, for their actual material, not what they have been shaped to appear looking like. And so a lot of his thoughts prefigure queer ecology. He proposes these sort of embodied experiences with nature. He's really against making nature a spectacle and dominating it. And he's probably one of the first to ask architects and landscape architects to design with nature, an idea that Ian McCarr will make famous in 1969. Particularly dualisms he critiques, which is, you know, a main kind of opposition that we'll see in queer ecology. So particularly like designers like Percy Payne, they really design gardens or informal gardens, or is this binary that you were picking your designs. And you know, he very much blames Victorians for this. He says, unfortunately, the duality of temperament with which Victorian garden was endowed was not to aid in the establishment of an artistic entity. And so his vision for communal landscapes was that this would be a new landscape and be a garden without boundaries. And a garden that was without boundaries, meaning that, you know, instead of just being completely fenced off, there would be some flowing space, usually with plant material, and then the community garden here, and then a more semi-private place here. So this was a kind of a detailed design that he did. He then writes about it in Gardens in the Modern Landscape, using the garden without boundaries as a kind of case point for Claremont Gardens, which is a landscape garden that was being carved up. And here he shows the population of 18 to about 800 people. He said, draws these correlations of how it's being butchered up like a cow. And he proposes these towers and then these communal landscapes here. And I think a lot of contemporary historians think, well, they're just upset because people thought he was controversial with all these kind of Corinthian towers in this historic landscape. But it was really this idea of not having boundaries. He then worked on an all-purpose house with Elizabeth Denby in London in 1939 and starts to promulgate. And that really goes against all the thinking at the time among planners. And this is a quote from Magnus in the English Landscape, who talks about, you know, how the suburbanization of the English landscape becomes an English predicament, a site not a pleasant town and country blend, but indeterminate, visually, socially, and psychologically. So as tons gets written about, you know, this octopus taking over these kind of feminized landscapes of suburbia. And, you know, they're very upset about the patterns. And so this is some of these 1930s ribbon road housing that they criticize. They detested the Garden City concept. But probably not for the reasons why you would think, because I didn't know this is one of the things I discovered, was they really thought it was challenging the sort of English gendered concepts of landscape. The female identified with nature and the man identified town and building, was blending that, and they were creating hermaphrodites. I mean, this book, I mean, it doesn't sound very much talent. Written in 1932, it is absolutely paranoid that they're going to have going to be a blend of females and males because of these garden cities, you know. And this is just a couple of quotes. It's what the book's talking about, this hermaphrodite landscape. See how intense it was. You know, a portal, loathsome nature which he worships, and you know, it's just pretty shocking. World War II breaks out, and so there's really not a lot of discussion of this because all the planners are now planning for war. Tunnard gets invited to interview at Harvard, and Walter Gropius is his biggest opponent. And so he accepts and he starts teaching in the landscape architecture program there. He meets James C. Rose, who would become a modern landscape architect, and has a relationship with him. He helps start TASK, which is a student publication created by the students. This is a comic that he writes for it, fighting fascism. And but he really doesn't get along with the landscape architecture faculty. They don't like him at all. They don't want him there. They don't want his guarding modern landscape. This is Norman T. Newton, and he writes Design on the Land, which is this history of landscape architecture that does not mention Tunnard once. It's what I had as a history book when I was a student, and he completely erases him from the history of landscape architecture. So Tunnard does join the Canadian Army, which I sort of hinted at the beginning. I think, he suffers considerably. I mean, I think if you were found out to be gay, you're in the military, that it could really have violent consequences. He gets an honorable discharge for an injury. And he ends up marrying Henry Russell Hitchcock's cousin, who is very wealthy and from a very established East Coast family. And he starts teaching at Yale. And this is the point where Cornelius, he comes back, he tries to work again at Harvard, he gets his Wheelwright Fellowship, and he ends up at Yale. And then really dedicates the rest of his life to historic preservation and city planning. And that's really what people know. I presented this to planners in his planners of history. They had no idea he was a landscape architect and had this whole other life, this whole other. Sense of landscape architecture, or what it is for landscape architecture. So I'm there. Sorry, I think I went a little over. But thank you.
So yeah, we have more or less 20 minutes for questions, comments, requests for clarification or further information. And yeah, someone wants to jump in, break the ice. Miguel, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking during your presentation, I remember that here in Queen, specifically in Queen, we have the student's house that we call the public. And one curious thing is that it was very important fighting the practice museum very important. But then nowadays, there's a thing that is pretty different from that time. When they were fighting the fascism, and you could see it because they were only men mostly, and then it became more liberal and stuff. But the curious thing is that nowadays that buildings work with no boundaries. So it's curious to see that in democracy, during democracy, and we don't see no boundaries. What I mean by that, everyone can get in. The doors are always open. And I was trying to get a relation between your presentation and how students that live there feel about it. Because when you come as a student, and they present that type of living way, most people will say, okay, I'm not ready to be sharing home with no boundaries at all. And then when you experience, when you go there for a visit or you get on a party there, and you feel the difference on the atmosphere. Okay, you feel we cannot talk about design because they were already, there were no new buildings, but you can speak of new way of boundaries because before they were closed, even in and even with the idea of the entrance were closed, and when you go in, but nowadays it's open either way. In the front, it's open already, and it's very curious. I don't know what type of relation you can make about your presentation like that, but it would remember me about the boundary related thing, because there's no really boundaries there, and I found it interesting. And with the gardens, there's plenty gardens in in Republicas, that's all it called. And it's kind of curious as well. And even there's a that's called Positive Salute. And that all the name mysteries as well. And there is a really nice presence, a queer public presence in Republica. So I find it quite interesting to relate with your, but it's just a smaller question. Of course, I don't have any question. Thank you for the
I don't know if you want to have like a rejoinder to what we just said, or okay. I have a few small questions, but if anyone else wants to ask, yeah, Tom, please.
I mean, you would think that we talk about anything, but sure. So we talk about think about this sequel that I hadn't seen before. You use the fact that experiences of what you COVID. So people in the say IceCon.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And then I've seen things that come from Joshua Hill. From Liberty, right? And
Oh, very.
middle is saying, we didn't even know what the next world. And so what we should do is conduct experiments in it and see what happens so that we can get a clearer picture of the ideal thing. Works up this very nicely. And Mill was thinking of these utopian experiments in the 19th century, especially with Robert Moon, but also in South Korea like that. They were questioning, and all of those experiments in living, it started with architectural landscape control plan. So you use the main, like there was a new level of before it was just like that, it was individually flowing into communal spaces where everybody would eat together, and so we knew how they didn't even marry. Right. So I wonder if Tunnard was aware of this. One day.
Yeah.
And you never know. I think you read on the it was right. And he was one of them. There's a backstory here.
Yeah,
You pull up.
yeah, interesting.
See new line of inquiry popping out. Really quick things, maybe. So here's perhaps a typical question coming from a Portuguese person who knows close to nothing about architecture. I noticed at St. Anne's, one of your pictures from one of the PowerPoints had like this gallows mode in the column, if I'm not mistaken. I wonder how common was this or how innovative in terms of what he was doing, because it actually reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you've heard of the style Manuelino, which is kind of a Portuguese late Gothic or flaming Gothic thing, where the king, Dom Manuel, in Portugal, had this magnificent buildings decorated with sea-like motifs, like shells. And so it kind of really directly reminded me of that. But I was wondering, I mean, is there a history of using these things in landscape architecture, or is he innovating? Why was he doing this? And then I had another thing, but
Yeah. So that's actually designed by Fox and Misted.
okay,
It's he renovates it.
okay,
Yeah, he was. Yeah,
okay.
It's Toronto. Yeah, and they were very popular in England.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
So it wasn't from it. Okay. I used to.
Yeah.
Okay. So another different thing. So I get you got me thinking about sandstone, etc., and this idea that selfhood gets embodied into garden design. So if I followed you correctly, so this comes a little bit from Shenstone's experiments, his circle, etc., but then kind of influences Tunnard. How conscious were both of them about this? Was this like an intentional project that is, thinking about selfhood, etc., specifically through garden design? And what's the role that embodiment and lived experience playing there? Because it's your interpretation. I mean, were they like, are there like clear signs of their reflections on this? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I think that actually definitely Shenstone's been written about that this was this idea of, understanding his identity by experiencing the landscape that he designed at ESOS. That was, and I think, I don't know how conscious it was on Tunnard's part, but I think almost any architectural landscape architect, if they're designing a place for themselves, it reflects who they are, right? Or who they want to be, or who is paying homage to, right? So I mean, I think, and that's why they invite, all these people from the architectural world for luncheons and for dinners and for parties, just to show off St. Anne's Court and St. Anne's Hill. And so I think it was serving in a similar way that Shenstone was using Lissos. But then, Lissos was much more, I would say, overtly, because, you were supposed to experience and religious poetry and view, lakes and ponds and streams and statues and created in the garden.
Okay.
But yeah, to what I think it's always there for designers who are designing their own house.
Okay.
Yeah, their own spaces.
Then again, if I might just add one final thing before shutting up, but maybe it was conscious, maybe it wasn't conscious, but concerning, you were wondering about whether his book would be like this sort of queer manifesto, homiletical, let's say. But this was never assumed, right? So if I got right, like the last part of your presentation about his biography, so then he moved to Yale, he started working on completely different things, etc. He went to the army and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, obviously due to the way in which gay people were, treated back at the time, but he was always hiding in plain sight, right? So it's kind of like that, like always masked. It's secret. So he never owned up, let's say, to any of this that we are reconstructing as hypothesis. That is, that we can find like some sort of hidden queer manifesto in his book, right? Let's get this right. Okay. Cool. So you're actually showing that you were given in place. Now you want I'm asking this like of queer.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
but I didn't even know if he was a woman that was aware of it either, right? I mean, I think, I don't think there was a sense of identity then either that we have now.
Right.
Right. How do you identify yourself? I don't think people were asking in those days that way.
Okay.
But I think like just the cover, and I found, it's pretty brazen. 1938.
He was gay. He was kind of hiding that he was gay. He was getting married, etc. But the way in which, like, this translated into his work and even what he did at St. Anne's, and there are hypotheses that makes good sense in this.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Just follow.
Yeah.
So one, we just with intentionally hiding in plain sight and subtly,
Yeah.
right? And then they don't go easily back. And so he actually saw whether consciously. But then on the self-creation side of things, you mentioned how for Shenstone, it's sentimental. It's a sentimental look, right? Or there's a sentiment, which is very 18th century. To create yourself is to create a feeling being, a being who has certain kinds of feelings about why this is a sentimental. And I wonder if kind of if there's a residue of that in Gardens of One, if that's in Tunnard as well. Does he talk much about emotional responses, phenomenal responses, what it's like to experience and
And it's the fact that he gets that from Pater, I think, because he writes a lot about embodying that, but not in the sense that he was very much against sentimental ideas of nature and sentimentality. I mean, didn't knew that in his idea of modernity at all.
you have to see like sentimentalism.
Yeah.
Sentiment, which is just a
Yeah, and it comes through in the way he writes about his experiences with landscapes. That I get into a lot more detail in the book because
does he stand out for that, like compared to other figures writing at the same time?
yeah. In fact, I compare his writing of an experience with the landscape to Norman T. Newton, the Harvard historian that writes a lot of history, essentially racism. So I mean, yeah. So there's definitely comparison.
Just one quick thought, and then that a lot of people nowadays put formalism on one side and sentiment on the other side as a binary. And so he's actually talented that binary. Like that is still pretty common response to modernism and formalism. It's cool.
Oh, really?
Don't think people think that people would find that.
Yeah. I guess abstraction in general, right? Yeah. Interesting.
Other things? Just a quick follow-up on what Dom said. I didn't want to but perhaps an interesting way to think about how to mediate that tension between, hiding in plain sight and then the construction of the self is to think, I don't know. I was thinking about what he did at St. Anne's, like with the room, like that tactic he had to, conceal the band, etc. You can think of, I don't know if I should speak about, split cells or multiple cells, or like this difference between intimate relationships as being some sort of locus or site for an authentic selfhood versus what you show. I was thinking also about Herrington Goffman's notion of roles and social roles, etc. You're one thing within your intimate circle, and then there's another different thing that you have to show to the world. I'm not being very convinced, I'm not making much sense, but this sort of notion that you have like a true self that you hide from some people, and that's your authentic self, or that there are like different aspects of selfhood that you can display within different social roles. Maybe that's a way to mediate this tension between, hiding and, constructing yourself through, I don't know, landscape design or whatever. So this was just, I'm thinking out loud.
No, I think that's what Noel Carroll did so well.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he was constantly almost toying with the press, right?
Sure.
In his 1930s celebrity magazines and stuff. It was really interesting. So then I think some of it is that, sort of, there's the, the real likelihood of being found out, but at the same time, kind of relishing in being able to toward people's perceptions. Yeah.
Wish
It's just a comment. So thank you, first of all, for your presentation. My apologies for I arrived late because I confused the dates of the conference, so I arrived late.
But I need to coming to this example of the best. But yeah, well, I'm interested in hermeneutics of architecture, so I work a lot on that. And for me, what's interesting in this example is to what extent a house can encapsulate what is it doing. And also, this is striking because in a way, I don't know if you would agree, and in this way, it's like if we find a fundamental question of architecture that is to know exactly what is a house, but not in abstract, but what is a house for a specific way of living. So, and for me, today I think this is a good question because life is changing rapidly, not only between gender issues, but for instance, regarding technology. So the specifications of the house today, some of them they don't make sense. So sometimes we adapt houses. So for instance, bedrooms nowadays become smaller because we only need them to sleep, and the common areas of the house they become bigger. It was not like that. So less separations, but greater spaces. So we have the period of enormous windows, whatever. And the question is always to know how can my life be underlined or developed or achieved or accomplished within a house. So this is, I think it's today. I think it remains the question. If for me, computer is the center of my life, should how can we change? For instance, does it make sense to have a living room and not just a cell? Our computer. So, but this is like, so this is for me the context of architecture, where we work with this concept that a house is first of all a metaphor. This, for me, it was very interesting. I don't know if you would agree with this.
No, I think that's, and I think this is really what they were asking themselves, the architects in the 1930s in England when they were having these experimentations in living. And I think it continues, the idea of home, I think, continues to be problematized for all different reasons, whether it's technology, whether it's gender and sexuality, whether it's even who has the right to have a home, who is homeless, right? So it's, I think it's really very foundational.
Okay. Any final question or we're wrapping this up? Okay, so please join me in thanking once again Susan for this marvelous lecture.